You already know this story. A garden, a tree, a piece of fruit, a woman who listens to a talking snake, and a world that breaks because of it. We have heard it since childhood, painted in soft colors, simple enough for a children's book. But the story you know is built on a single English word, serpent, and that word is hiding something. In the original Hebrew, it is not one idea, but several, layered into a single name, each one buried a little deeper than the last. And the moment you read it the way it was written, the gentle tale you were taught quietly falls apart. The text never said what you were told it said. To see what it did say, we have to go back to the very first word the text uses to describe it. Genesis chapter 3 opens without ceremony. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. That is the sentence in nearly every English Bible ever printed. Simple, familiar, and on its surface, entirely ordinary. The text introduces a creature, a beast of the field, and at first glance, there is no mystery here at all. It is an animal, one of the animals God had made, and it is about to speak. We should take that surface reading seriously before we move past it, because one honest interpretation has always been the simplest one, that this was a literal creature in a literal garden, and the strangeness of a speaking animal is exactly the point. A sign that something has gone wrong in the order of creation. That reading deserves respect. It is the plainest sense of the words, and we are not going to pretend it does not exist. But here is where the English begins to fail us. The word translated serpent is the Hebrew word nachash, and nachash is not a quiet, neutral label the way our word serpent is. It is a word with roots that branch in several directions at once, a word that an ancient listener would have heard ringing with associations that no English reader ever hears. When the translators reached for a single, tidy word to carry it across into our language, they had to choose. And in choosing serpent, they made the sentence simple. They also made it smaller. This is the first thing to understand about the entire story, and it will follow us all the way to the end. We did not inherit the text. We inherited a translation of the text. And every translation, no matter how careful, is a series of decisions about what to keep and what to let go. Somewhere in the long journey from Hebrew into Greek, into Latin into English, the layers inside nachash were quietly set down and left behind. We were handed the serpent. We were never handed the rest. So the first mystery is not whether the serpent was real or whether it was something more. The first mystery is simpler and stranger than that. It is this: what did the original readers hear in that opening sentence that we have completely stopped hearing? Because they did not hear a children's story. They heard a word chosen with enormous care. And the care begins not even with the serpent itself, but with an echo, hidden in the verse that comes just before it. To find that echo, we have to step back one sentence, into the final line of chapter 2. There, the text describes the man and the woman in the garden, and it uses a single Hebrew word to capture their condition. They were arumim, naked, and the word carries more than nakedness. It carries exposure, vulnerability, a complete absence of defense or disguise. They stood in the garden with nothing hidden and nothing to hide, open and unguarded, like children who have never learned to be afraid. Arumim. That is the last note the text sounds before the serpent arrives. And now listen to the very next sentence. Now the serpent was more arum than any beast of the field. Arum, crafty, shrewd, cunning, the capacity to conceal, to calculate, to say one thing while meaning another. It is, in almost every way, the precise opposite of the innocence we just heard. And yet, And this is the detail that should stop you. It is very nearly the same word. Arumim. Arum. The same sound. The opposite soul. This is not an accident. This is not a coincidence of vocabulary that the original author stumbled into. This is deliberate, sculpted, intentional writing. The text places the naked innocence of the humans and the cloaked cunning of the serpent side by side, separated by a single sentence, bound together by a single sound. It wants you to feel the collision. The unguarded meets the calculating. The exposed meets the concealed. And the bridge between them is a pun so quiet that thousands of years of English readers have walked straight across it without ever knowing it was there. Now, there is an objection worth raising here, and we should raise it before anyone else does. Someone will say, this is just clever language describing a clever animal. The serpent is shrewd the way a fox is shrewd, the way a predator is shrewd. The wordplay is just decoration. And to that, the answer is this. A storyteller who builds a pun this precise, this early, at the exact hinge of the entire narrative, is not decorating. He is signaling. He is telling you, in the architecture of the language itself, that this creature is not here to be studied as an animal. It is here to function as something else. A force defined entirely by its cunning, set in deliberate opposition to human innocence. The prose is engineered, and once you know it is engineered, you cannot read the rest of it the same way. Because if the sentence around the word was chosen with this much care, then the word itself, nachash, was chosen with the same care. So what, exactly, is inside it? This is where we open the word completely. Nachash is not one meaning. It is a knot of several, and the ancient ear caught all of them at once. We will take them one at a time, and we will be honest at every step about which threads are solid and which are only suggestive, because the discipline matters more than the drama. The first thread is the plainest. As a noun, nachash means serpent, a snake, a literal, crawling creature. This is the meaning that survived into English, and it is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. It is the one layer the translation kept, and it kept it by setting the others down. The second thread is where the floor begins to shift. The same three consonants that spell nachash form a verb root tied to divination, enchantment, the practice of reading omens and working hidden knowledge. We are not guessing at this. The Torah itself uses this root elsewhere precisely in the sense of divination and enchantment. So the word for serpent and the word for occult enchantment are, at the level of their root, the same word. To the Hebrew ear, the name of the creature already whispered of hidden knowledge, of forbidden insight, of a voice that deals in secrets it has no right to share. This is solid ground, and it is unsettling enough on its own. The third thread is more contested, and we will mark it clearly as interpretive rather than certain. The same root has associations in some readings with shining, with brightness, with the gleam of polished bronze. Some have heard in nachash not only the serpent and the enchanter, but the shining one, a being of light and brilliance, rather than dust and scales. We cannot prove the original author intended this. The linguistic evidence here is suggestive, not decisive, and an honest treatment has to say so plainly. But it is a possibility the sound of the word leaves open, a possibility the ancient ear may have caught, and that we have long since stopped hearing. And there is a fourth thread, one that comes not from the word, but from the world around it. The serpent was not a neutral image in the ancient Near East. Across the cultures surrounding Israel, the serpent or the sea dragon was the great symbol of chaos, the cosmic monster that threatened the order of creation, the adversary the gods had to subdue to to hold the world together. Israel's neighbors feared and named these creatures. This background is real, and it presses on the Genesis story, whether or not Genesis names it directly. The first readers did not meet the serpent with a blank mind. They met it carrying centuries of dread about exactly this kind of creature. So now place the threads together. Serpent, enchanter, possibly the Shining One. And behind all of it, the long shadow of the chaos monster. This is what the single English word serpent was asked to carry, and could not. And it is here that the great division opens, the question that has split readers for 2,000 years. Was the nachash a literal creature, a real animal through which something spoke? Was it a symbol, a personification of chaos, of temptation, of the human capacity to be deceived? Or was it a spiritual being, an entity the later tradition would eventually name as Satan himself? 3 readings, 3 different stories. Hold the one you lean toward, because by the end, it will change what the entire account means. Whatever the nachash was, notice what the text is strangely uninterested in. It never describes its body. It never tells us its size, its color, its movement, whether it was beautiful or monstrous. For a creature that has dominated the human imagination for thousands of years, Genesis is remarkably silent about how it looked, and that silence is itself a clue. Because the text is not interested in the serpent's body at all. It is interested, with total focus, in its voice. The weapon of the nachash was never venom. It was language, and the text shows us, with surgical precision, exactly how that weapon works. Listen to the first thing it says. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Consider what that single question does. God had said nothing of the kind. God had given the garden freely and named one exception. But the serpent reframes the abundance as restriction, the generosity as prohibition. It takes a command surrounded by freedom and quietly repackages it as a cage. It does not begin with a lie. It begins with a question engineered to make the listener doubt what was actually said. This is the architecture of deception, laid bare. First, the question that distorts. Then, when the woman answers, the half-truth, "You will not surely die," a statement that contains just enough of reality to feel trustworthy while inverting its meaning entirely. Then the appeal to hidden motive, the suggestion that God is withholding something good, that the command was not protection, but jealousy. Step by step, the serpent does not overpower. It persuades. It does not force the fruit into anyone's hand. It rearranges the listener's understanding until reaching for the fruit feels like wisdom. And here someone will object, reasonably, that animals do not talk, and so this whole scene must be pure myth. A fable with a moral, nothing that touches reality. But look at what the text is actually foregrounding. It is not asking you to marvel at a talking animal. It is asking you to study a method. The thing it wants you to fear is not a snake that speaks. It is deception that works through speech. The slow, patient reshaping of what someone believes to be true until they walk willingly toward their own ruin. That threat is not ancient. It never went extinct. It is the most modern danger imaginable, and the text isolated it thousands of years ago with a clarity we have barely improved upon. And once again, the English flattens it. We say the serpent tempted the woman, and we picture seduction, enticement, a piece of fruit made to look delicious. But the Hebrew shows something colder and more precise. An argument, a strategy, a dismantling of trust conducted entirely through carefully chosen words. We were handed temptation. We were never handed the full picture of how the deception was actually built. And then, the moment the deception lands, the text does something to the serpent that tells us what it really was all along. Here we need to lower our voices, because this is the quietest and most revealing detail in the entire account. And it is almost universally misread. When the judgment comes, God speaks to the serpent first, and the words are these: "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." To the modern reader, this sounds like an origin story, an explanation for why snakes have no legs and move along the ground, a just-so tale about the natural world. And read that way, it shrinks into zoology. But that is not what crawling on the belly and eating dust meant to the people who first heard it. In the ancient Near East and throughout the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, this exact language is the language of total defeat. To be made to crawl, to lick the dust, to eat the earth, is the posture of a conquered enemy. A defeated king forced to the ground before his victor, stripped of all dignity, humiliated before the watching world. The prophets use this image for fallen empires. The Psalms use it for vanquished foes. When the scriptures want to describe an enemy brought utterly low, this is the picture they reach for again and again. It is not a description of anatomy. It is a sentence of utter, public humiliation. And consider how strange it would be to read this as mere zoology. If the verse were only explaining why snakes have no legs, it would be the single most out-of-place sentence in the entire chapter. A quiet nature documentary dropped into the middle of the most consequential judgment in human history. The surrounding verses speak of pain, of toil, of exile, of death entering the world. The idea that, in the middle of all of that, the text simply pauses to account for the anatomy of reptiles strains against everything around it. The language is not zoological, it is judicial. It is the verdict pronounced over a defeated adversary. And now recall the shadow we uncovered earlier. The chaos monster, the great serpent of the ancient imagination, the cosmic adversary that the gods of the surrounding nations had to fight and subdue to keep the world from coming apart. This is precisely how that defeat was described. Not the demotion of a reptile, but the subjugation of an adversary.
The text is using the vocabulary of a conquered cosmic enemy, brought low, forced into the dust, defeated before the story of humanity has even properly begun, which leaves us with a question the curse forces upon us. Who is humiliated like this? Who is sentenced in the language reserved for fallen kings and subdued monsters? An animal does not need to be publicly disgraced. A snake is not a defeated enemy. The punishment fits something far larger than a creature of the field, something the text describes as conquered, even as it refuses, still, to name exactly what it is. And the curse does not even end there, because in the very next breath, it stops being a curse at all. It becomes a prophecy. The words turn, mid-sentence, toward the future. "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." In a single line, the account pivots from describing a defeat that has happened to promising a war that has not yet been fought. It opens a conflict that stretches far beyond the garden, between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, a hostility planted at the beginning of the human story and pointed, deliberately, at something still to come. Notice the asymmetry buried in the imagery. The woman's offspring will crush the head, a fatal blow, a wound to the very seat of life. The serpent will strike the heel, real, painful, but survivable. The text is not describing a stalemate. It is describing a long war with a decided outcome in which the serpent wounds, but the woman's line ultimately destroys. From a curse spoken over a single creature, the verse expands into a promise spoken over all of history. And there is a word here that the English barely lets us see. The text speaks of the serpent's seed and the woman's seed. And seed is itself one of those loaded Hebrew terms that means far more than a single child. It means lineage, offspring, a line stretching forward through generations, even a singular descendant standing at the end of that line. By using it, the text quietly insists that this conflict is not between the woman and the serpent as individuals. It is between two lineages, two lines of descent, two streams running through all of human history. The enmity is not a moment. It is an inheritance passed down on both sides, generation after generation. It is this verse, more than any other, that later readers seized upon. In Christian tradition, it acquired a name, the Proto-Evangelium, the first gospel, the earliest hint of a deliverer who would one day crush the adversary's head. Generations read this line as the opening note of an arc that would not resolve for thousands of years. And we have to be careful here, careful and honest, because two different things are happening, and they must not be confused. There is what the Hebrew text states on its own terms, a lasting enmity, a crushed head, a wounded heel. And there is what later tradition built upon it, an entire theology of redemption read back into these words. The first is on the page. The second is interpretation layered over the page. Both are real. They are not the same thing, and a disciplined reading keeps them distinct. But the fact that the tradition built so much on this verse raises the question every reader has been holding since the very first sentence. If the serpent is a defeated adversary, locked in enmity with humanity across all of history, the target of a promised crushing blow, then is this still merely a snake at all? When, in the long history of these texts, did the serpent of the garden become the Satan of later belief? Here we must be more careful than anywhere else, because here is where credibility is either earned or thrown away. So let us state the central fact plainly without softening it. The book of Genesis never names Satan. It never calls the serpent the devil. It never identifies the nachash as a fallen angel or a spiritual being in rebellion against God. In the text itself, in the Hebrew, that identification simply is not present. Anyone who tells you that Genesis says the serpent was Satan is reading something into the page that the page does not contain. What actually happened is more interesting than that, and it took centuries. The identification of the serpent with a cosmic spiritual adversary accrued slowly, gathered over time, layer upon layer. In the centuries between the Testaments, Jewish writers began to develop a fuller picture of a spiritual adversary, and began to look back at the garden through that lens. And then, at the very end of the Christian scriptures, in the book of Revelation, the connection is finally made explicit when it speaks of that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. There at last, the serpent of Eden and the great adversary are named as one.
But notice the distance that language travels. That identification sits at the far end of the entire biblical canon, written down more than 1,000 years after Genesis. And so, a reasonable person will object. But Revelation says the serpent is Satan, so surely that is what the serpent always was, all the way back in the garden. And the careful answer is this: meaning can gather across a canon without the original author having intended it. The writer of Genesis worked with the layered, ambiguous nachash. Later writers, reading in the light of everything that came after, saw in that figure something the first author never named. That is not deception. That is how a tradition reads itself over time. But it means we cannot collapse the end of the story back into its beginning and pretend the Hebrew said what only the Greek of Revelation would later say. And yet, the opposite objection fails just as surely. Someone will conclude that if Genesis never says Satan, then the serpent was, after all, nothing but a snake. But we have already seen why that cannot be true. The engineered pun, the layered word with its enchantment and its shining and its shadow of the chaos monster, the language of cosmic defeat written into the curse. All of that lives in the pure Hebrew, long before Revelation was ever conceived. Even stripped of every later layer, the serpent of Genesis was never merely an animal. It was always more than zoology, and always less than a clearly named devil. So whichever camp you have been holding, literal creature, symbol of chaos, spiritual being, the text gives each of you something real to stand on, and denies each of you the comfort of total certainty. So when we strip away both the cartoon snake and the borrowed devil, what is actually left on the page? Let us state it plainly, twice, with no confusion and nothing invented. The Hebrew of Genesis never says Satan. It never names a devil, never identifies a fallen angel. What it gives us instead is the nachash, and serpent is a flattening of that word, a single tidy English term standing in for something built to mean several things at once. Serpent, enchanter, possibly the Shining One. And behind it all, the shadow of the chaos monster the ancient world feared. The text is deliberately ambiguous about what the creature is, and at the same time, it is utterly precise about what it does and what it becomes. What it does is deceive through patient, engineered speech. What it becomes is a defeated figure, cursed in the language of conquered kings, sentenced to a war it is destined to lose. That is the answer, and it can be held in a single breath. The Hebrew never says Satan. It says nachash, a word carrying serpent, enchanter, and the shadow of the shining chaos monster all at once. And it describes that figure with deliberate vagueness about its nature and total precision about its method and its defeat. The serpent is not explained. It is portrayed as the cunning, the deceiver, the adversary already marked for ruin. The fact is settled. The Hebrew text is layered, deliberate, and far stranger than the children's story we were handed. We were given one word, and the word was true as far as it went. But it went only a fraction of the distance the original traveled. What remains open is not what the text says, but why it chose to say it this way. Why, of all things, did it refuse to simply name what it was? And that may be the deepest secret of all, deeper than any single meaning buried in the word. Perhaps the secret of the serpent was never its hidden identity. Perhaps the secret is the silence itself. Consider what the text could have done. It could have named the adversary outright. It could have told us plainly whether this was a beast, a symbol, or a spirit. It had every opportunity, and it declined every one. Instead, it gave us a word with the edges deliberately left unfinished, a figure defined by what it does rather than what it is, a darkness that is described in motion and never pinned to a single form. And that refusal was not a failure of the text. It may have been its most careful choice, because that empty space, that deliberate withholding, became something every generation could fill. Each age has looked into the ambiguity of the nachash and seen its own image of evil staring back. The ancient reader saw the chaos monster at the edge of the world. The later tradition saw the great spiritual adversary, the devil with a name. And the modern reader sees, perhaps, the quieter terror the text foregrounded all along, the voice that reshapes what we believe to be true, the deception that works not by force, but by patient, reasonable words. The serpent has worn every face we have given it, and the text allowed that, by never insisting on only one. So a study of a single word becomes, in the end, something larger. It becomes a mirror held up to us. The question was never only what the serpent was. The question is what we have always needed it to be, and what that, in turn, reveals about how human beings have understood the nature of evil itself. The text left the door open on purpose, and we have been walking through it, each in our own way, for 3,000 years. There is more waiting in this same garden, hidden in the same careful Hebrew. The meaning of the tree, the flaming sword of the cherubim set to guard the way back, the strange and loaded word the text calls the seed. Each one has been flattened by the same translations, and each one holds more than we were ever handed. If this kind of patient, honest return to the original text is what you came here for, then you belong here. Subscribe and follow the channel as we keep reading our way back into the oldest and most carefully written mysteries in the Bible, one buried word and one forgotten layer at a time.